This is your Class 5 Extra Topics on medieval childhood and what it was like growing up during the medieval period. I'm not going to focus a lot on royalty just because their upbringing was so different from everybody else's. That's like talking about the 1% and how they live versus how everybody else lives. So the first thing I want to talk about is William Marshall, and this is actually one of the best documented biographies in medieval childhoods that we have, because his life was written down by somebody who knew him, who got those first-hand accounts, so it's a really reliable biography. And William Marshall as a child, he was nobility, he was raised by a lord, but at one point his father was under siege because he was had switched sides and was no longer supporting King Stephen in England. And his father wanted to buy some time to kind of shore up his supplies and regather his troops and that sort of thing. And so as part of his agreement to surrender to King Stephen, he offered up his son, William Marshall, as a hostage. And at this time, William was very little, I think 5 or 6. He was young. He didn't really understand what was happening. But William Marshall was taken by King Stephen kind of as a promise that his father would behave. William Marshall's father did not behave. He did renege on the deal, and King Stephen threatened to kill William. He paraded him around his father's castle, saying they were going to catapult him back in, and they were going to cut off his head, do all these horrible things to him. And his father had said, called out to King Stephen, "Do whatever you want. I don't even care. I don't like the kid." William was 4th of 8 children, so it's not like his father didn't have other children. But this is a good example of kind of the concept we have of medieval child rearing, is that you had a lot of children most of the time. And the perception is that parents didn't care about their children. I'm going to get into that a little bit more later, but this is one of those classic examples of a medieval childhood where you were used as a pawn. A lot of having children was about political manipulation, and we're going to see that here in a minute. So specifically for non-royals, the mother was the primary caregiver, and this was because the father was out doing better things, hunting, warring, working. So mom was primary caregiver for most children, right around the time they hit 8, and then they would go into the fostering system. And what's meant by this is you would foster out your children to other families. Theoretically, you would aim for a politically well-connected family because you wanted your child to be politically connected. It was considered a great honor to have your child fostered with royalty, and at any given time there could be up to 100 children being fostered by a royal or very close to royal family. And this purpose was, you wanted them to meet other children their age, they wanted the best tutors, and you wanted them to find those connections, to kind of forge those political relationships that would come in handy later. So traditionally you would try to foster up, but at the very least you would foster at an equal level. Education was a very, very real thing for these children. Boys would learn etiquette. They would pick up a trade, whether it was animal husbandry or riding horses. All the boys could ride horses, but blacksmithing and that sort of thing. And fighting was always a part of that because you always needed soldiers, particularly in the medieval period. Girls really learned household management and how to run the household, command their servants, and that sort of thing. A lot of etiquette was happening. They would learn to sew and embroider and kind of maintain that home. Now, the reason there's a misconception about parents not caring about their children in the medieval period is because mortality rates were really, really high. It was up to 40% by the time they were 6. So 40% of children would die before they hit the age 6 years old. A big chunk of that is those first early years, but even by the time they were 3, 4, 5, they were still dying in pretty high rates. And a lot of the deaths that we see come from children who were doing work-related things. So little girls would fall into wells and drown, or they would be burned by the fire and not survive, because those were the things their mothers were doing, were gathering water, tending the fire, cooking. And so little girls tended to get hurt in that way, whereas little boys died a lot in horse riding accidents and weaponry accidents and that sort of thing. So this was a lot of it. Obviously, disease was a huge issue. Nothing was really sanitary at this time period. But it is a misconception. Parents did care about their children. They were attached to their children, and they did love them, even though there were high mortality rates. There's a big misconception that parents didn't really care until a kid got to be 8 or 9, but that's absolutely not true. Now, childhood ended when you hit puberty. For girls, this was 12. For boys, this was considered 14. You were old enough to take a spouse and to really take your place in your own household and in the world, which is why we see a lot of really young girls getting married and having babies, and particularly if you're familiar with royal history in this time period, you'll see that a lot. As far as discipline, it was really interesting. There was a big discouragement of indulgence. You didn't want to indulge your child. You wanted to punish them vigorously and frequently for their misdeeds. And so there was a concept that hitting your children, beating, whippings were common and expected, because that was how your child learned to mind you. And there was a big fear that if we didn't instill our children with the proper fear of God, that they would become indulgent and sinful. Remember, this is the medieval period. Everybody's really into religion, and so indulging your child was really bad. I'm trying to remember the quote about spare the rod, something the child did. But spoil the child, that's what it is. Spare the rod, spoil the child. And that was really a concept that they bought into in this medieval age, that children needed to be punished vigorously. Again, religious studies were incredibly important. Children spent a lot of time at religious ceremonies with their families. Baptisms, Easters, Christmas, these were all very, very important parts of the cultural experience, particularly as a child. Most children would learn Latin so that way they could attend church services and understand it. If they learned to read and write, they read and wrote in Latin for the most part. And a kind of kooky example of childhood in the medieval period is the Children's Crusade. Now, we had two of them in 1212. The first one was Stephen of Cloyes. He was British, and he had this idea, claimed that Christ came to him and told him that he needed to march on Jerusalem and retake Jerusalem for the Christians, for the Catholics, I guess, at the time. And so he gathered up an army of 30,000 children, and they marched through France, and they got to Marseille, which is right there on the Mediterranean, and they boarded boats and were never seen again. Popular history says that some of those boats sank, that some of these children were sold into slavery. There's a whole lot of speculation about what happened to these children, but nobody really knows for sure. But again, that's a good indicator of how important religion was to these families and these children, that they would let their children go on a crusade with no real leader. I mean, Stephen of Cloyes, I believe, was 12 years old, so he wasn't technically an adult yet, as far as their concept was. And he led this army. Now, we had a similar movement come out of Germany with 20,000 children who ended up in Italy, and the Pope said to them, this is a good thing you're doing, but you can't go, your children. Some of those children did end up leaving, and again, their fate remains a mystery. But children were very religious, were very active, and were expected to be little adults, particularly around the time they started fostering at eight. They would be expected to behave like cultured young adults. So really, growing up in the medieval period was a much more accelerated version of our youth and growing up today. So that's medieval childhood for you. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll be seeing you in class.